Hello and welcome to Season 6, Episode 1 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
I'm Mark Bishop.
and as always, with a new season, we are starting a new book, this time talking about James Hitchcock's History of the Catholic Church, published in 2012. James Hitchcock was a St. Louis University professor, so that's part of the reason why we chose this book, but we could talk about that in a little bit. I know you just mentioned right before we started recording that you wanted to recap a little bit of our last episode, our very first episode of Unlimited Guests with Dr. Austin Freeman. It was a good time. I think it was a very good episode. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't. I don't. We haven't talked in detail about it since then. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts were. I thought he was uh, obviously a very smart guy. I don't think he's going to take my advice that he should write fiction or creative work, but I think it's everybody's lost if he doesn't.
I don't know.
So
He seemed pretty open to it. He said he would take it into account, and I think he meant that. I think he did.
I don't think he meant it. I think he was
You don't think so at all?
but he was polite. I think he would have enjoyed a little bit more having just a discussion with you. But anyway, seems like a really nice guy. Certainly very smart, and appreciate him coming onto the show.
Yeah, if anybody listening right now didn't listen to that episode, they should absolutely go do that, because I think that was genuinely one of the best episodes we've ever recorded. I think that was
Really, I've had a number of really good rants over the years, and that was rant free, almost. I think.
I mean, yeah, I guess so. I mean, he did bring in the Calvinism and the calling people doctors. So I think he really made sure to get those jabs in. That was funny. That was great.
Well, I didn't go on a rant though. So
No, he was just responding to your earlier rants. So kind of by proxy, it was bringing in old rants. That was funny.
Yeah, I mean it was pretty amazing. He really did listen to that entire season.
Well, before we started recording, because what we were because when we said, because I kind of gave an introduction, I'm Adam Bishop, this is my dad, Mark Bishop, and he goes, what did he say? He goes, still Mark Bishop, and I'm like, so he actually listened to every single episode of that season. He's like, yeah, I did. I was not expecting him to have done that.
Yeah, he says, yeah, I did, and then I immediately said out loud, oh no. I was like, oh no, he knows me too much. Too much about me, and I wasn't universally praising his book either. I had some criticisms of it, as far as trying to divine Tolkien's intentions and all that. And so I think some of the earlier chapters I thought were a little confusing as far as, okay, what is this describing Tolkien's view or just Tolkien's writings and that. So
yeah, but from the sound of it, it seems like he would welcome those kind of criticisms. I mean, we were talking about a lot of the criticisms that he's gotten, and it's just been like comments on him personally, and the book is awful, even though people haven't read it, that sort of stuff. So it's very different.
Well, that's today's world, I guess. It's a lot easier just to cast aspersions than it is to do the work and really effectively insult people.
But of course, you're very good at that.
Well, I don't know anymore. Kind of lost my passion for criticism, personal criticism. I don't know. I'm getting dull in my dotage. Is a good word. In my old age. Leave. I guess it's who was it? It was Socrates, as quoted by Plato, I think, that talked about how beneficial it was, or it is, when you get older and your passions subside. I think there's a lot of truth to that.
I think that's also Cicero too. Later in the Roman period, because I think he wrote a whole basically essay on old age, if I'm remembering correctly, and sort of the benefits of old age.
Yeah, well, he was a very passionate person, I think, throughout his life,
Yes.
but especially in his youth, and kind of hurting his own prospects by not thinking before he speaks and stuff. But I mean, I thought it was a great interview. I thought you did a great job interviewing him, and it was kind of funny how he volunteered I interrupted his defense of those that have PhDs. He didn't really get a chance to lay it all out, but I started mocking him before he was able to do. Actually, not mocking him, but mocking the idea that we should call people with PhDs doctor, like we do medical doctors that have actual practical knowledge.
Well, maybe we just have to bring him on the podcast some other time so he can finish explaining himself without you cutting him off.
Well, I think I think I agree with what he was going to say and started to say, which is it takes a lot of work to get a PhD, and especially in some fields, it is very valuable to have a PhD. What I object to is people inserting that into their title.
That's true.
Because I respect people who have a lot of knowledge, like he does. I mean, he was obviously a very smart, very highly educated, and very knowledgeable person. But I don't respect him. I respect him for that in that particular way, but I don't respect him any more than a really good carpenter. I mean, a really good carpenter has knowledge and experience and talent in its own way. And so I don't call a carpenter a title, and I'm not going to call a PhD a title. And quite frankly, if I know a doctor, I just generally don't call him doctor. I know that, I'm good friends with a dentist. Now they're not really as hung up on being called doctor because they're not MDs either. Start making all the dentists angry. But
it's like a quarter of our audience. So we've lost all the dentists. Who's going to listen now?
I'm anti-dentite. To quote Seinfeld or Kramer. Anyway, but I call her by her first name, but then in her office I have to catch myself because I don't want to show any disrespect in her professional world. But I don't really call doctors doctor unless I say, hey doc, that type of thing. If I know them or if they're treating me, I'll just call them by their name. And so what my objection is are the professors and the academics that insist on being called doctor, and it really bothers me. And I'm doing it out of politeness, but it really bothers me when the local superintendents who have doctorates in education that say, well, I'm Dr. So-and-so of the such and such school district. Okay, well, I'm Mark Bishop Esquire then. I mean, it's, what is really, I mean, a doctor of education could be probably is the most useless PhD outside of a studies program, which it really is a studies program because it's not actual knowledge. It is the study of how to convey the knowledge to other people, I guess. It's not like biology, chemistry, where you actually have to know anything.
Linguistics.
It's not even, it's not as rigorous as linguistics.
Yeah.
Education degrees are for people that can't pass a regular course of study.
That's
they are on the same par. I'm insulting everyone now. I don't know why I got on this rant.
No, you're just on this rant. And I want to clarify before you go any further. Dr. Freeman did not insist on anyone calling him doctor. He said that explicitly, that he is not someone who insists upon that. So you're just getting mad at the concept, even though he himself did not do this.
I am acknowledging that he was right. That takes a lot of hard work for him to get his PhD, and for those that truly devote themselves to a field of study that is worthy. I am on an unrelated tangent rant about other people that are not him, and I think with that I should stop because no one cares. But I can go on a rant. I can go on for another 10 minutes if you want.
Let's get into our actual book here that we're supposed to be talking about. History of the Catholic Church. So why are we covering this book? We were kind of thinking generally, history of the Catholic Church is something that you said you've been interested in for a while, and especially coming off of, a whole season on theology. I think it kind of made sense to keep it up with the religion, with the Catholic stuff, and look into the history of the church.
Well, it kind of echoes back to the first chapter, which is history of Western philosophy, where I haven't read the book. I've just read the introduction, but the idea, or my thought was, we're going to limit it to really one theology as it's gone, as it's developed over time in the history of it. And of course, it's a fascinating history of what little I do know of the Catholic Church. I've read some, but my dad was was really a self-taught expert on the history of the Catholic Church, and I have a general philosophy of not regretting mistakes that I make, because the theory is that even those mistakes help me improve myself, as long as I realize there are mistakes and I don't repeat them. But one thing I do regret is that I didn't keep. He had a a multi-volume set of books that were the history of the Catholic Church, and we donate them to the church, the local St. Peter's parish after he passed. But I don't know that they kept them. I don't know they really had an interest in them, and I should have kept those. But anyway, he taught the history of the Catholic Church to the RCIA group. He was actively involved in the rite of Christian initiation for adults and for people becoming Catholics, and the priests and the other participants that were involved said that was like their favorite topic of all the discussions, because the history of the church is, involves corruption and scandal and also deep thought and conflict and philosophical discussions. And hopefully this book does it justice, and I'm looking forward to it. And it's always a subject that I thought I need to learn more of. And there's always a defense of the Catholic Church that, of it being the one true Christian religion, because it has been there from the beginning, and even throughout all these turbulent times and the sinfulness of all the humans involved, it has somehow lasted and endured and grown, and it is very strong. So might as well look into it. I was.
And so for this episode, we just looked at the introduction to this book. And I'm hoping you were the one who took notes on this, because I think that's what our agreement was again for this season, because I didn't take any notes. It was a short little section here. But do you want to start us off? What did he talk about in the introduction here?
Well, first I'd like to say it's short, but these pages are big and there's a little type. So it's not, this is going to be work. And by the way, I honestly didn't think that this podcast would last a full season. I am still amazed that we are now in season 6. I'll keep doing it as long as you want to, but
we're close to 3 years, but we're like a few months short of 3 years of doing this.
Hey, isn't that crazy?
That is crazy. As
long as you're willing, I'll do it. Before we get to the introduction, did you notice the imprimatur?
I did.
Did you?
I did.
I feel like I thought I saw something you didn't see, which is the Most Reverend Edward Rice, the auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, consented essentially to the publication of this. And if I remember correctly, canon law is very important. This type of when you're studying canon law, you're actually, I've got a book what is it called, the annotated canon, the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church, and in the introduction to that volume, it states that you're not supposed to study it except for as part of a religious study, really kind of sanctioned by the Catholic Church. But I bought it off of Amazon, so I figured I was exempt. But you have this disclaimer in there, but you make it available to anyone who wants to buy it. So that kind of reminded me of that book, and that this professor at SLU got that, had a review done evidently of this book, and while they aren't endorsing everything that's said in the book, they are kind of gave their stamp of approval, which I would assume that it was probably necessary for this to be included in seminaries, because you got to figure this is somewhat like a textbook, and it'd be consistent, I guess, with Catholic teaching to a certain degree. What are your thoughts?
Nothing contrary to church teaching is contained in this work. So yeah, very clearly stating it. No, this upholds, actual church teaching. This isn't, just some crazy dude saying, this is what I think about the Catholic Church. Right. Here's my wacko conspiracy theories about, why there's corruption, why everything's evil and awful. Now, this has been approved by, evidently some pretty high authorities. So it looks like it should be good. Well,
at least the auxiliary bishop in St. Louis, which is not even the head guy, but
basically second to the Pope.
I'm gonna say a couple things, which is second to the Pope. I'm gonna say a couple things that are a little off topic, and as just an introductory rant about the Catholic Church. So part of me with that imprimatur, I'm reassured by that, that this is not, like you said, some crazy theory, but it also causes me a little bit of concern that there's going to be nothing controversial, especially as it gets to the modern era, and probably is going to be less critical than it should be. And I note that I have, well, you probably don't even aware of this, I had real struggles with the Catholic Church mainly when I was a young prosecutor, and there was a series of, well, not a series, there were a couple prosecutions. I was not directly involved in them, and one in particular of a Catholic priest in St. Louis County, and that priest was Reverend Kuchar. And one of the problems we had with it was that Kuchar molested a couple altar boys, and he was ultimately convicted. But the elected prosecutor was Catholic. The assistant prosecutor assigned to the case was Catholic. The detectives who investigated were Catholic. The victims were Catholic. The judge, I believe, was Catholic, and he confessed outside of the confessional to a priest and a nun that he'd done these things. In spite of all that, they didn't just have their main attorney that handles their run-of-the-mill DWIs and stuff, because priests commit crimes too, speeding tickets and that kind of stuff, which is a great attorney by the name of Marty Hadigan. I think he's passed. They had Marty in it, but they also hired Scott Rosenblum, who anybody in the St. Louis area knows he's one of the most prominent and most expensive criminal defense attorneys. And they tried the case. So he didn't plead guilty. He tried the case, and he was found guilty. But during the trial, he wore his clerical. The trial, of course, happened like 2 years after the charge was issued, and the charge was issued years after the molestation. I think a couple of years after molestation, anyway, because it involved minors. And so he wore his clerical collar, and he brought a Bible with him every day of trial, and put the Bible in front of him very theatrically, and as if he's this pious person. Eventually, after he was convicted and went to jail, they removed him from the not from the church. They didn't excommunicate him, which I don't know why you wouldn't. But they did remove him from the priesthood, I guess. But that was a long time after. And one of the people that was involved on the church's response and coordination, if you will, it's a kind of a loaded word in this case, was a Reverend Stika, who I guess I don't have any direct personal knowledge of this, but let's say he was less than cooperative than he could have been. He ended up being, of course, going to Rome, and then he ended up being a bishop himself in Tennessee. And just within the last month, he resigned under a cloud of suspicion because he had been investigated for some period of time for aiding and abetting a homosexual person who was in the seminary, kicked out of the seminary, I think. He was accused of some sort of sexual misconduct with a couple of different parishioners. And Monsignor Stika has lived for many years with the former bishop of St. Louis. They lived together, traveled together. And upon his resignation under this investigative cloud, he is going to return. He says he's going to return back to St. Louis, of course, with his partner, the former mayor, a former bishop of St. Louis, whom he lives with. I'm sure they're just like good buddies. And there's nothing inappropriate about that relationship or his relationship with these young seminarians. But anyway, so I want to put that out there, that as a completely, not completely, it's a directly related fact that the current Catholic Church is corrupt in a lot of different ways. And so I think the fact that this has a stamp of approval in 2012, when this was published by the Catholic Church, probably means there's not going to be a whole lot of mention of that when we get to the end of the book. And so maybe I'll just have a rant ready at that time too. Or I'll
That's
just
a good idea. We'll add our own extra chapter onto the end where you could just elaborate on the 10 years of church history since.
Well, it's disheartening. And that was when, so this was published after Kuchar was convicted, because I left that office in 2007. So this was published 5 years after I left that office. And that was pretty early in my tenure. So we're talking probably 10 years before this was published, when all that went down. And that was just one case. And of course, we all know it happens over and over and over again. And there's a big problem. And, if any listeners will be offended, but there's a big problem with the homosexual culture within the seminaries and with the leadership. And I don't have problems with homosexuals, and I don't have problems with homosexuals being priests, but there are problems that are associated with that in a spiritual setting when they're supposed to be monogamous and celibate. It's a lot easier for two heterosexual men to be celibate, living only with another heterosexual man, than it would be for two homosexual men. I'm just guessing. I mean, I'm not homosexual, so maybe it's the same. But I think there's big problems with that, and it goes all the way up to the top, and I think it makes it very, very difficult for those other priests who have to deal with that scandal, as the famous Norm Macdonald rant. Do you remember what I'm talking about? The whole teacher rant.
Yes, of course.
The Teachers of the Heroes rant. Well, he also mentions, like how more teachers rape kids than priests, and then he talks about if he was Father Norm and all that stuff. Anyway, so I will digress. Let's get started on this introduction.
Yes.
After I've wasted 20 minutes or so of our listeners' time. But and those are all my comments, not Adam's comments. So if anybody cares, he has not yet agreed with any of that. All right, so the into the introduction. I mean, it starts off the way I would hope it would, which is the statement: the Catholic Church is the longest enduring institution of the world, and her historical character is integral to her identity. And boy, that's the truth, because most of the time, when you talk to people in the Catholic Church, one of the number one reasons why they defend the church and the faith, one of them is that it has, like I said earlier, it's withstood the test of time, and it was there from the beginning and still goes strong in spite of all this stuff. In spite of what I just read, I went on. I'm still Catholic, and I'm just not happy with the current administration, and it's just a matter of either reforming it or waiting it out, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then there's a discussion about the historical, that it's a historical religion. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really true, more so than maybe other Christian faiths or other religions, because it is based upon a specific guy that lived. I mean, and one of the really good books I read a couple of years ago was A Case for Jesus, which really talks about, okay, this person lived. Certainly, a lot of these things happened. Now, you might, you don't have to, necessarily agree that he performed miracles and he rose from the dead and all that stuff. But it kind of leaves you with the question: okay, well, there's a historical accuracy of the person being alive because there's contemporaneous records and all that. And then, so you're left with, okay, what did he do with these things or not? But mm-hmm. But it's a historical religion in that it starts with a particular birth of a particular person. Mm-hmm. And so that is kind of different than, like Buddhism or Hinduism, and we've talked about those kind of beliefs and their mythology and their creation myths and those kind of things, which are different. The Judaism is historical mm-hmm. religion, because it also talks about Abraham and Adam and all that kind of stuff. Not you, Adam, but yes. The Adam. So what are your thoughts about how he starts off with that historical description of the Catholic Church?
No, I think that's a good point, and I think it's sort of going back to what you're talking about Judaism, where it's the lineage of Jesus and the lineage of all of these great leaders within the Old Testament and everything. That's something that's very much described in detail. It's like, okay, this person was the son of this person, the son of this person, son of this person. You go back and you go back and you go back, all sort of just tracing the roots here to get back to again in the end Adam and Eve. So I think it's a good point to make, that it is more founded in who historically lived at this time, and then where this kingdom rose up, and it's less, I guess, sort of just sort of ethereal, maybe, if that makes sense. Like, oh, it doesn't really matter if these people really lived, because it just matters if their message is true, which I think is sort of the vibe that you get from a lot of other more quote unquote spiritual people or other faiths, where it's just like as long as the message is good, it doesn't matter if this is inherently true. But I think especially with Catholicism and Judaism, there's a much greater feeling of, no, this is true, this is accurate, this is historical.
Yeah. And then he continues on to the historical critical method, where you're talking about putting the writings in their historical context, and then he goes on to some, a kind of a description of that, or maybe a criticism of that process. But by the way, I think when I was young, maybe I just didn't learn or wasn't taught, but as I got older, I hear more and more of this historical context, which I think is really really fascinating when they talk about, okay, here's this passage and this is a parable, because a lot of the parables, of course, are about, the lost sheep and all that, because, a lot of them raise sheep. And so they would understand that. And so people that live in the city or like suburbs like myself, you don't really understand what you're even talking about as far as leaving the flock and going to get that lost sheep. But understanding like the world in which he lived, the historical context, I think is really valuable to really even understand, what he's talking about, especially the parables and what's happening, and then of course the history of Judaism and the references to the prophets and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's really, really valuable. And it is also kind of interesting how, in some ways, he was a product of his times too, because there's not, and there's a mention of this like feminist theory and that kind of thing. But it wouldn't have been. I guess it could have been possibly God, but there's no reference to women being equals, exactly equals. There's not, I don't think there's anything in the Bible that I'm aware of that says they aren't. And certainly Jesus had interactions with women that could have been considered scandalous, like Mary Magdalene, or he and of course with tax collectors and all that stuff too. Which nowadays you wonder, what do you mean by tax collectors? Like somebody who worked for the IRS? Is it really that bad? Well, maybe, I don't know. It depends on if you paid your taxes, I guess. So, but then he talks about that it's important, even accepting that, it's important that not that when you're looking at that, not to have an inordinately suspicious view of the Christian origins of the story, and to not have faith. Or read it with some sort of spirit of faith rather than just complete skepticism about everything. What are your thoughts about that part of it? Anything you want to share about that?
That's a good point. I think he's kind of weighing like the pros and cons there for a little bit of this historical critical method. He says, it's valuable help in understanding the precise meaning of words, recovering the social and cultural milieu in which Jesus lived, things like that. But then he goes on, a little bit later, kind of what you were saying, where it's, if you're just completely skeptical and it's just like, everything is just so dependent on the context, there's really no like more spiritual thing, you kind of fall into this trap of, there's nothing really divine there. It's just the life of some dude. And it's just, you could have robbed a lot of the life of Jesus and, a lot of this Christian stuff of its like actual, spiritual meaning.
Yes. And he makes a good point that this completely skeptical look at it offers no replacement theory. As far as a theological or a philosophical replacement for if you're going to be super critical of everything and super skeptical that he did X, Y, and Z. And so it's so he mentions Christians must ultimately read Scripture with the eyes of faith. Its central message, salvation through Jesus Christ, is incomprehensible to those who treat it as merely a human document. So I think that is an important thing for somebody like him to put in an introduction of the history of the Catholic Church, because I think it will be important for us to kind of keep that faith alive as we're talking about as a church struggle with different philosophical and theological arguments over time, sometimes to the point of violence. The one thing he did mention in some detail, well, not a lot of detail, but Gnosticism. I was not really familiar with Gnosticism, and I'm still not really familiar with Gnosticism. Do you know anything about that? Like, I've heard about these other what do they call them? The other gospels, the I don't know if they're hidden gospels, or what I'm talking about. Like there's a gospel of Thomas, and I didn't know that there's one that claims to be Mary Magdalene. Do you know anything about those? I've never read them or even looked at them. I've heard some things about them, but I haven't really looked into it.
I mean, not too much, very surface level stuff, kind of just what he says here is, it's, there's claims that these exist and that the church has just tried to cover them up because, it's goes against their official teachings, and it's just another symbol of corruption. And it's clear that, Jesus didn't actually live because they contradict each other, just things like that, where it's, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? If it's a very like, what about if, sort of idea, I think.
Right. And he makes a good point that bringing those Gnostic gospels up, which challenge the fundamental nature of the understanding of Jesus and the other gospels as being factually and specifically true. He says, the people that proponents of reading those and studying them seek to reopen questions that have been settled since at least the 4th century, which is true. I mean, there's an acceptance at some point that they are not accurate. Of course, I'm suspicious enough of government and church hierarchy to buy into some sort of conspiracy theory, but he does make a good point. I mean, it's been settled that these are not accurate, and it's kind of like us looking, 1,500 years later at Tolkien's writings and questioning, saying that they are a different gospel or something, it's hard for us, especially this far away, harder for us, I think, to make that kind of determination whether they're accurate and they should be part of the gospels.
I think that's also something that Austin Freeman brought up specifically in our episode with him when he was talking about, people who, especially, I think he was talking about the New Testament specifically too. He's like, you'll see a lot of people who go around saying, I've found this new reading of the New Testament. And he's like, well, chances are it's either just not new. Somebody has said it in the past and it's been disproven, or if it is actually genuinely new, it's just crazy. It's just kind of founded on nothing. It's just spitting out, whatever's on your mind with no real basis for it. So I think that's an important thing to consider is, there's 2,000 years of church history. Chances are if somebody says, well, this person was wrong about this specifically, that topic has probably been covered by like 5 different church doctors, in the past 2,000 years, right? These are questions that were thought about with among like the best minds in the world at the time. So it's important to remember that, it's people who say that, this is now wrong and we now have the information that can just disprove everything are likely kind of crazy.
Yes. I agree with that, but I will say this, to bring it in a modern context, Joe Biden just this week ordered the continued sealing of all the records of the JFK assassination. I think it was this week, certainly this month, within the last month. And the question is, and Tucker Carlson actually just brought this up in an interview he just did with Russell Brand, of all people. It was a great episode. Look it up. You can watch it on Rumble. It's about a little over an hour long, but he mentions that, and he says, nobody alive had anything to do with it. So why do you have to have, it's been so long ago. I mean, that was 60, it was before I was born. I'm 53 years old. So it's been 60 years. So the only thing you could possibly be protecting are the institutions, the CIA, or other people that are involved, other organizations are involved in it. And so, here we are in a modern state where we have presumed access to public records more so, and more literate people, people that can read and write much more so than the 4th century. Would it be impossible for them to have a conspiracy that disregarded these other gospels? I don't know. Some part of me says, I don't know. but I don't agree with that point of view. But there's a possibility. I don't. I'm not going to completely discount that could happen, especially when so few people as a percentage of the population were literate. But other things, they still argued about everything. So I figure somebody would be arguing one way or the other. But anyway, so then there's a discussion. I think we talked about that since the 4th century. Yeah. So then there's also needs to be a discussion about church history that about the reducing questions of faith to factual struggles within the church, and of course there's going to be struggles and arguments between people. But then he talks about modern feminism has a lot to do with the Gnostic Gospels, to make their point of view as and to treat the Gospels just like the myths of other religions, rather than it being an accurate factual discussion of what he actually said and what he actually did. And you see a lot of that. I see a lot of people trying to take Jesus's words out of context. Who was it? There was somebody recently said he was pro-trans. I can't remember where they got that from. I'm like, man, that was a concept that nobody even would consider in that era. I mean, they have a lot more common sense. I mean, people that bred animals for a living would have a much more clear understanding of the difference between the sexes than we do.
Have you seen the video of the Sparkle Creed?
Is that the one where the crazy leftist Lutheran
I think so.
has like a rainbow sash and is giving the false
Yeah, well, it's basically mocking the Nicene Creed,
right.
basically just taking it and modifying it to really just center around transgender stuff. Because I think she starts with I believe in like a multi-person God whose
Yeah.
pronouns are they, them. It's like, what are you talking about? This is insane. What is this? What is the point of this?
I'm getting more and more convinced that there is actual demonic possession
Mm,
going on in the world as the days go by. Because that was one of my big problems when I was younger with the Gospels was really there's like people running around. I mean, it seems like I don't know how many people that Jesus had demons, save them from demons, demonic possession, but it was more than two. I mean, it seemed like every town he go to, there's at least like three guys that he has to get rid of these demons. And I was thinking, what is going on there? Because we don't see anybody
hmm
in demonic possessions in modern day. Was that just people that were mentally ill? And now I'm starting to think, my Lord, maybe there is such a thing. You hear about these terrible crimes,
hmm
especially like people that don't have a history of violent acts or mental illness, and all of a sudden they snap and they kill a whole family. Or
hmm
like that Las Vegas shooter. Remember him?
hmm
They buried that news. I don't know what the heck happened to that. He shot up that whole country concert with I don't know how many weapons and how many rounds from up and I mean, how does he get all those weapons into a suite up in Las Vegas without anybody noticing? I
hmm
mean, room service never came in, I guess. But then the FBI says they don't even know what the motive is.
hmm
I have two problems with that. One is, man, that guy had to have been possessed, like some sort of demonic possession, or the FBI's lying about
That's true.
motive or something. I don't know, but I started thinking about stuff like that,
Mm.
and then that person when I saw that, I thought, yeah, maybe. But there's active Satan worshipers now, that aren't afraid to mention it. They have tattoos and that kind of stuff, and they purport to worship Satan. Why not?
There's a satanic band that I think's threatening to sue the state of Missouri because somebody, some preacher wanted to host a worship night at the Missouri State Capitol, and he was granted the ability to do it like on Capitol grounds and have a worship night. And then a satanic band, I think I don't even know if they ever actually applied to like even go through the process, but they've been saying, if they let him do it and they don't let us, do our satanic performance at the Missouri State Capitol, then it's clear discrimination and blah 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 blah, and we should sue them and blah something something. But yeah, no, it's I think increasingly everywhere.
That brings up my old theory of that the governor has the power to preemptively pardon people.
Mm,
Uh, and I first thought of that back when the Westboro Baptist Church, have you ever heard of them? They're not really a thing anymore, I don't think. But they used to protest at a soldier's funeral saying that the God hates gays and the soldier died because, the United States is evil or something like that. And they made a big ruckus, and it was a big controversy because people just wanted to kill them.
yeah.
And so I came up with the idea: why doesn't the governor just preemptively pardon anybody who commits simple assault on these people, and just say, if you do that, now don't break any bones. I'm not gonna pardon any felonies and no
Mhm.
murder,
Mhm.
but punch him in the face. I'll pardon you. Is that? I mean, is that legal?
I
Or
mean, I think that's got to cross some line somewhere. I think that's a
maybe
governor
that?
giving permission to commit crimes. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's all.
but isn't a pardon, exonerating them after the fact?
That is true.
I guess maybe that would be a conspiracy to commit the crime,
Mm.
because he's encouraging it. They're committing a conspiracy, but then he can just pardon himself. You know?
I guess that's true. Yeah,
So, so the Satan band should watch out if Mark Bishop ever becomes governor.
be an interesting day.
Yeah, well, it's still risky because whenever you have a fight, there's always a risk of serious injury. So
That's,
you gotta be careful.
that is
to use that much force that is necessary.
Yes.
I'm not advocating for violence. That was the joke. All right. Now, moving right along.
Back to the book.
Back to the book. The next section talks about the historical character of the church and the development of doctrine. And as with, he says, as with the truth of the Bible, it is a question that ultimately cannot be settled without history itself, but only by faith, right? So there has to be some faith as to the proper development of the doctrine. And he has a good point of view with regard to that the church is not just a theoretical belief system. It's also the sacraments, that. But he mentions the development of the doctrine is a progressive widening, and not progressive in the modern sense of the word, widening and deepening of the meaning of the original truth. And heresy can be either false innovation or a rigid adherence to older teachings, which I never even thought of as heresy being somebody clinging to the past.
Yeah.
And then he also talks about the liberalization of the I think he just kind of alludes to it, like Vatican II, and then the Christianity of the Catholic Church coming to different societies and the strength if the faith in the belief system is strong, it'll overcome those pagan influences. Otherwise, if it's weak, it may be subsumed by them. I'm kind of skipping ahead with that last point, but what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about those subjects, or anything else within that period? I'm going to go back to the.
I like what he has to say there, because I mean he starts it out by saying even the earliest Christians recognized that every single aspect of the faith is not within the Gospels. There is a need for other teaching. There is a need to kind of go off of that. And that's sort of a big problem I have with a lot of the Protestant faiths that are the sola scriptura, the scripture alone people, who are like, well, we can't listen to anything the church says. We just have to find it within the Bible. If there's not one specific quote from the Bible that reflects this exact thing, then it's not an accurate teaching. But I mean, I think clearly, you have to have some things that are just not explicitly described in the Bible in order to have a faith, that fully covers all of the new issues that we face. And one of the funniest arguments against all the sola scriptura is to ask them if they believe in sola scriptura, where sola scriptura is in the Bible, if they can provide a quote that says only use the Bible and nothing else. And of course, there's no quote that says that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I don't. That is kind of a funny way to look at things. I mean, I like it in the sense that it has a foundation, and that it's built upon that solid foundation. But then it's like a foundation that you build on a lot, but you don't have any timber. So you don't build the first floor and the second floor. You don't have a house. You got a great foundation. It's going to be there forever, but it doesn't really complete the purpose of the foundation.
Right. I do believe, that the Bible is the ultimate authority. The Bible trumps anything that can be written into the catechism. If it goes against the Bible, then it's not an accurate teaching. But the Bible just does not cover literally every single thing that we face in the world today.
Right. Well, it didn't cover everything that they faced in their world.
True.
I mean, it didn't cover everything. It gives you the general principles and the teaching of how to use those that information going forward, and all the various things that people have to do. I mean, in some ways, the world is more complex today, and sometimes it seems like it's more simple than it was back when it was more of a struggle to live a daily existence. It's a lot easier now, a lot more simple in the sense that we don't have to struggle to get food generally in the West. But I never even thought of, on the heretic side of it, that a heretical thought could be a way to test the strength of the faith, because you're forced to explain it, you're forced to know it, to know that what's wrong, and then also that you could be a heretic if you're clinging to old views that are wrong, which I hadn't even considered those two possibilities. But I did think that he didn't mention, of course, he's not going to mention it because I guess it's been stamped correct by the Catholic Church. But moving away, and one of the reasons why I think the Latin Mass was so effective, of course, that was before my time, really, that they changed it, was that everybody was saying the Mass in the same language at the same time. And I think there is a benefit to that. So you don't have because I think over time, over the next century or two, you're going to have a bigger and bigger risk of having a different church liturgy throughout the world. I mean, they're trying to consolidate it and retranslate it to make sure everybody's on the same page, but with different languages. You wouldn't have to do that if everybody just learned Latin, you know. And so I think there's a risk to that when we're talking about bringing it to new societies and strengthening it and using the pagan ceremonies and adopting them within the Catholic Church, and like having a St. Patrick's Day Mass, well, of course that's a Catholic figure. Let me think of somebody else, some other pagan type thing that you just kind of, well, a lot of the Christian, well, of course there's a controversy about whether all those were pagan or not, but like the evergreen tree was certainly used as a pagan symbol of life. And so that's part of the reason why we use it today as part of our Christmas celebrations. Anyway, any thoughts about that, or should we move along?
No, I think that just about covers it. Let's move on to the next topic.
Well, I have the next topic as rather talking about objectivity. That there has to be ways to interpret things through faith, and then talks about the church being a sacramental. I think I already talked about this, the theological hatred, the odium theologicum he talks about, where there's people that disagree about theology in the church history, and they should not create hatred among themselves. And I like this little quote: "The church believes that despite such human frailties, such as these discussions and the anger and the disputes, despite such human frailties, the Holy Spirit protects her from fundamental error, and that good is brought out of evil. And that left entirely to men, the church ought to have perished at many points in her long history." I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think that's one of the strongest arguments for the Catholic Church, Catholic faith currently, because as far as the historical development of it. Any thoughts?
Sounds very similar to Tolkien's idea of eucatastrophe.
Yeah.
The bad that has to happen for good to come. Also reminds me, I think I've mentioned this story on the podcast at least once or twice. In the Decameron, the Italian book from the 1400s, where everybody's telling different stories. One of the stories is a Christian and a Jewish man make a bet that the Christian man says that if the Jewish man goes to the Vatican, and if he sees enough good, he'll then become a Christian. He'll come back to the Christian, whatever. But if he doesn't see enough good, if everything sucks, then the Christian man has to become a Jew. And so the Jewish man goes to the Vatican, and he just sees all of this horrible corruption, all of these terrible things going on. Everybody's just profiting off of each other. And then he comes back to the Christian. He tells him everything he sees, and the Christian's like, "Oh no, this is awful. He's seen all this horrible stuff. He's never going to convert. This is terrible." And the Jewish man ends his speech by saying, "But because of all of these awful things, I see now that the Holy Spirit is truly at the center of this church, because if this was just something made up by humans, it would have fallen apart a whole long time ago. And so the Holy Spirit has to be keeping it all together."
Yes, that's funny.
Yes.
And I think there's some element of truth to that. Either that or evil is strong enough to persist, which is a different, opposite argument.
That is true.
Like the Dark Force, this Star Wars reference, which your Tolkien reference. I have written at I'm going to skip to the very last paragraph of the introduction, where he says, I'm just going to read it. "The Protestant historian Herbert Butterfield saw the action of God in history as like a composer masterfully revising his music to overcome the inadequacies of the orchestra that plays it." And I wrote next to it Tolkien, because that's pretty much like how Tolkien viewed his mythology of the creation of his universe through the song, and that what was it? It wasn't Sauron. It was the other dude that perverted Morgoth, that perverted the music that created the world, and then like they had to overcome that, and then it ends up using that as those false notes to improve the universe that had been created. So I just thought there was kind of like an overlap in those theories. Did you make that same reference?
Yes, absolutely, of course.
That's funny. We're starting to think alike, especially about that. I'm going too far into the Tolkien wormhole.
Yeah, I think so. I think I've like
Uh,
finally converted you to be a super huge Tolkien fan. This is great.
yeah, except for I'm lazy, and so I would have to read a lot. Because he wrote so much.
Yeah, that's true.
I need like I like paperbacks, like like 150 pages or less. And Tolkien is not that.
No, he's not.
Okay, so going back a little bit, one of my additional thoughts I thought he made were very good. Oh yeah, that the where you're talking about the history, where he's talking about the history of the church and just studying history, especially with regard to religion and philosophy and morality. I like this little quote on page 16. Rooted in universal human nature, sin is a constant in man's affairs. Although its character and intensity vary with time and place, and I think that's important for anybody who studies any church. That you got to make an allowance for any religious organization to have dealt with, because it's a human creation. It can be inspired by God and maybe helped by God, but you have to keep in mind that no one's perfect. Not even the clergy, or maybe especially the clergy. I don't know. Um, and then, do you want to comment on that, or can I move in the next one?
I liked what he had to say. The sentence immediately following: "Those who deny that a tendency toward evil is basic to human nature cannot make sense of history, which becomes merely endless, incomprehensible tragedy." So if you just kind of go around thinking people are generally good and just want to help each other and sort of the live in peace and harmony and stuff, then it's like, okay, why does all of this awful stuff keep happening?
Yeah.
You have to recognize that humans do have this tendency towards sin. That doesn't mean that every human is intrinsically evil, but it just means that there is this intrinsic tendency to move towards those things.
Yeah, and that's a point that he makes a little bit later, the next page, where he talks about that moralism, that we're all created as good people and then society corrupts us, which is Marxism. But it's in that philosophy, such as he says, such moralism is perhaps inevitable in secular liberalism. And I think that's a lot of the main struggle with public policy nowadays, with liberals or progressives or leftists or whatever you want to call them, or they want to call themselves, is that they believe in their in humans' moral superiority and almost perfection, and it's the external forces in their lives or in society at large that causes people to be bad or do bad things or have bad outcomes, as opposed to we're all sinners and we need to limit the bad that we do. By our society and our governmental function. I think that's really the fundamental philosophical difference between the left and the right in a very real way. I think as they approach questions of how to address certain public policy provisions in a philosophical manner.
And that's really something that comes sort of out of the Enlightenment, when you're seeing this great shift towards everything can be achieved just through reason. We don't really need this religious backdrop anymore. This idea sort of sprang up that humans can be perfected if we sort of perfect the world around them. We can sort of just control humans to be good if everything just makes sort of this logical sense, and if we just construct this society in this perfect way, then everything will happen. I think that's really where that fundamental shift started happening between the more religious and the more secular, where it's this idea of the more religious recognize that no, people can do have this tendency towards evil, whereas on the other side, like exactly what you were saying, it's this idea that society makes us evil, and if we perfect society, we could perfect the human being, but that's impossible.
Yeah, and was it yesterday? I was just watching a documentary with Eli, your youngest brother, about Thomas Sowell. Maybe it's Friday, and because he asked me about the podcast and stuff, and he says, who do you think is the best philosopher? I said, ever. And he said, yeah. And he said, what about the best modern philosopher? Who's your favorite? I guess he said. And I said, well, it took me a minute to think, and I said, Thomas Sowell. as a modern philosopher, social scientist, and all that. And he says, "Who's that?" I felt bad for not teaching him. So he was. I said, "Well, you want? I'd love for you to watch an interview, because Thomas Sowell's a really. I don't know if you've ever seen an interview with Thomas Sowell. If you haven't, you ought to Google, like, one of the really good ones. He's got a series of them with Uncommon Knowledge with Peter Robinson, who's kind of pompous, but he does a great job interviewing people. And this was done for a few years ago, and it had like 6.5 million views. He talks about he used to be a Marxist, and he says it's a wonderful theory to believe in, because it makes everybody is good, inherently good, and you just have to fix what's wrong with society, and we'll have utopia. And so Peter Robinson says, "Well, why'd you stop being a Marxist?" And he says, "Facts." Because he studied stuff, and he's like, "Well, this doesn't work. It doesn't work that way." And anyway, so it's kind of funny that 2 days later I'm reading this introduction and I'm thinking the same thing, and he's stressing the same point about the leftist, or the if you're reading the his history with that point of view that people are good but the structures are bad, and that's what creates bad things. You can get a bad reading about things. But it also, I think it can be that he talks at some length about one of my pet peeves of people, where they talk about, I think you alluded to it, bad things happening to people over time, and he mentions edifying stories of devout people saved from danger by divine intervention. A city spared the plague, an angelic visitor steering a child away from a precipice, leave unanswered the question why countless other people, even more pious and innocent, have been allowed to perish. And then he talks about Christianity gave history a goal that doesn't explain everything. Like in history, why some good things happen, some bad things happen. But of course, I have this big pet peeve about people say, when like their kid is lost and then 2 days later is found, they say, "Well, God delivered up our child to us because prayers." And I always feel bad for any parent out there who lost their child and never came back, or the child died, because then I guess God caused that kid not to come back. It's the implication. But he's talking about it more of an historical sense. That the Christian, a study of Christian history, or when you're a Christian, you're studying history. You can see that bad things are going to happen. We just maybe not understand them all, but the idea is that we're hopefully moving towards a proper end of history and an improvement of ourselves and our societies, if we stay true to the Christian philosophy and belief system. Any thoughts on that?
No, I agree. And I think to tie that back into Tolkien with his sort of worldview as everything as sort of a story and stuff like that, I think that's a great point to make. Is it's like if you don't see the ending, everything does just seem kind of miserable sometimes. And I think we've talked about this before. It's like, what do atheist people really believe in? Like I believe atheist people could still be good people, but it's like, if you're seeing this horrible, sort of awful world around you with all this crime and all these horrible things happening, it's like, what are you looking forward to in the future? If it seems like things are just keep getting worse. But sort of Tolkien's point is, of course, in the story, it looks like things aren't going to get better, but we need to sort of look at things from outside of the story. We have sort of the ending, within the Bible. We know what happens in Revelation. We know that, all Christians believe that, there's Christ is going to come back eventually. And so it's, you have to look at it from the perspective of, what is the story going to look like as a whole? It's very easy to look at it as sort of the slice we're looking at now and say, oh, everything's evil. Everything's just going to keep getting more evil and awful and terrible, and everybody's suffering. And we need to fundamentally, change everything about our society, even because everything's just going to keep going downhill. But you do need to look at it as a whole. There's an end to the story. There's a goal. There's something that's going to happen at the end.
Yeah. And I think there's not really a good explanation for the atheist, although I think Christopher Hitchens, who's now deceased, did as good a job as anybody. And one of the more modern ones, or more recent ones, and I don't know what his particular personal views are, but he had a character that he played. Ricky Gervais had a character he played who was atheist, and he had suffered some sort of loss. And he's explaining, how he goes on without, I think it's specifically about without believing God, but it could just be, going on maybe without faith or something. But he talks about, well, every day is a gift, and you're not promised anything at the end, so you should enjoy it, and the beauty of flowers and people and blah 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 blah. Of course, it is ultimately a dispiriting prospect if one day you just don't wake up, or one day you die a violent death and that's it. So yeah, it's a hard issue for them to deal with, and it's a hard issue for them not just to believe in taking license, just seeking pleasure at whatever cost. But of course, then you can have a counter argument. Well, just seeking pleasure entirely psychologically, we're not suited for that as sociable animals, so you should do it with moderation, et cetera, et cetera. But that's still the same argument of just trying to maximize pleasure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just in a different manner, because if you maximize pleasure, period, you will end up being psychologically bereft or ill or something. So you end up having a net negative. So you have to do the calculation differently, which is really just a different way of saying the same argument. Anyway, on a happy note.
Yes. Do you have any other thoughts, any other sections that you want to cover? I know we're just about at the end of this chapter here.
I don't think so. I'm looking forward to it. I certainly need to learn more, meaning that I have a lack of knowledge of the history of Catholic Church. I have a general understanding, but I don't know any of the details really. I mean, I kind of do some more than others, so I'm looking forward to learning more. What about you?
I thought the introduction was great. I think he points out, sort of what he's looking at here, sort of his process and examining, the history of the church here, where he's coming from. I like what he points out about all the issues with sort of the modern, skepticism. And I'm glad we're not just going to see a book, or hopefully we're not going to see a book where it's just, this is sort of just everything was awful back then, but we're good now. And, we can look at it and say, the whole Catholic Church was awful, but up until the modern day, now we're good. Sort of looking at things with a fair and balanced perspective is sort of the vibe that I got here, and that we need to be careful of those who try to moralize everything.
Yeah, and I'm glad for the introduction and the imprimatur, so that way I know, okay, all right, now I know his perspective is going to be, I'm expecting a mainline Catholic version of the history of Catholic Church within acceptable limits of knowledge, without speculation, is what I'm expecting. Let's keep it to the facts and a description, and try to be fair to everybody involved. I really liked his description of the prior disputes on theological grounds that were resulted in maybe even violence. And I hope and expect he's going to be fair to both sides and just explain why or how, rather than, like you said, moralizing and inserting his own personal opinions into the subject. So yeah, I'm hopeful.
Yes, so am I. Do you have any other closing thoughts for this episode of Unlimited Opinions?
No.
All right. Well, you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. Again, that's ULMTD Opinions. I guess I need to design a new T-shirt or something for season 5 and 6. I also think we still need to order the one for seasons 3 and 4. I just realized I don't think we ever did that. We talked about that like months ago and just never
sent me a link. I think what we need to do is we need to have a T-shirt with a picture of Austin Freeman on it. We could probably get his consent. We'll send him one.
I don't think we need to do that. I
think it'd be a great idea, don't you think?
Maybe for some sort of like season 10 special, and we can put all the faces of everybody we've talked about.
All right. I thought it was a good idea. And he didn't actually come out and criticize me or insult me, which I guess I'm a little disappointed in, because we could have used that as a quote.
Oh, there you go.
Well, if he's still listening, maybe he's got a hangover and he wants to listen to this season. If he does, he can hear this.
Mm-hmm.
Then maybe he can tweet an insult. I don't want just gratuitous. Mm-hmm. I want something well thought out. Like I think I've said before in the podcast, I'm not hurt by people who insult me about things that are not true. It really kind of hurts when they're right. So that's what I'm looking for. Something really sticks it to me.
Well, there you go. That's an open challenge to Dr. Austin Freeman, if he is even bothering to listen to this episode. I doubt he'll take up that challenge, even if he is listening. But I guess we'll see. But follow us on Twitter, ULMTD Opinions.
I bet you $10 that if he listened to this, he's going to do it. Although I don't know, maybe not. But I don't know if he could bring himself to do it. He doesn't seem the type to just insult people, even if asked.
That's true. That's true. That's
We'll
a good question. We'll see. We'll see.
We never find out, which is a way of finding out.
That's true. Well, this has been season 6, episode 1 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
All right. Well, 14 chapters after this to go.
Yeah.
So
All right.
for a solid few weeks. So I hope everybody's looking forward to it.
Oh, you're still talking. We're still talking to them. I thought we were done.